When is Mr. Scott in his office?
When is he in it?
Yeah, like what time do we talk to?
I don't know what his normal hours are. I would assume it's somewhere in the vicinity of 9 to 4. Stu, are you a nuclear engineering student? Okay, cool. That's what my degree's in. And are you a grad student? Okay. And you just want to operate the reactor for fun and supportive research? Both? Okay, cool. Awesome. You missed me talking about the syllabus, but just so you know, you can have whatever electronic device or note-taking or recording tool you would like. My policy is just if it's not class-related stuff that's on your device, you won't get counted for attendance. Okay, so whatever is easiest for you to take notes, if you want to have your laptop and look at the slides and take notes on them, all that's fine. But if it's not classroom materials up on it, you weren't paying attention, I just won't count it as attendance. So my general policy. Okay. So the AGN 201 reactor at ISU is essentially identical to all other AGN 201 reactors, which have been operated around the world since 1957. So this reactor, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. It was initially built with the idea that they would be put into high schools, and as the atomic age, that period in the 50s where everyone was super excited about all of the amazing things that nuclear could do, and you had your nuclear powered cities and your nuclear powered cars of the future, high schools would actually have these in order to teach students about the nuclear technology. It'd be a component of like your shop class, for example. That's not where we went. However, there are several universities that have AGNs. I've got some good friends at the University of New Mexico who've done a tremendous amount of really interesting experiments with their AGN. They took it apart, they took all sorts of measurements, and it really were able to do some cool things. So the reactor description in chapter 4 of the SAR is for the original Aerojet General, so that's what that AG, Aerojet General Nucleonics, AGN 201 reactor, right? When they created this reactor design, the NRC had to give them a design license, same thing that NuScale is going through right now, okay? So that hazard report and preliminary design report by Aerojet, docket F4, right? That's what we put into our SAR for our facility, is we said, hey, we have exactly what they designed and all these others. Here's that information, we just popped it in, okay? Then we went and did a few things in some of the other chapters that specifically brought that information to our facility, right? So in those chapters 1 and 3, when we talk about Pocatello, Idaho State University, the Lilly Bridge Engineering Building, and then the reactor lab, all that we put in. But a lot of this information is very standard in all the AGN reactors. And for those of you who are going to be reactor operators, that's very similar between different PWR and BWR reactors that were built by the same manufacturer and have the same hazard report and preliminary design, right? That design is licensed. They go pop that into the specific facility. The reactor hasn't changed, just some of the facility has, okay? So this is very standard, the way we're approaching this in the AGN SAR, very much the industry practice, okay? This is a low power reactor. Does anyone remember from last week or the tour what the powered reactor is? 5 watts, okay? It has a distinct advantage of its small size. We did not have to build a reactor building to house this, right? We could literally stick it in a basement lab, which is why this is so desirable for a lot of universities to have as the research reactor that supports their nuclear engineering program. Its uses are education and research, so it should be pretty obvious that we're not producing power, right? We don't really care about the 5 watts that it makes. We're not connected to the grid anywhere. This is also something that's very standard when you're talking about research reactors. typically the NRC does not want to regulate a reactor for research and development purposes that is also connected to the grid. That is one of the reasons that NuScale is building at INL, because they're going to be DOE regulated so that they can do their experiment and test, and they can feed out to INL's experimental grid, right? Without having quite the same difference of approach that a commercial reactor has, right? So typically there's a split, and you're either producing for the grid or you're a research reactor. No external cooling system is required for this reactor. It has a very low operating power, which translates to very low temperatures. We don't boil the water in our tank. We don't have bulk boiling. And so there's no need for pumps or coolant condensers or anything like that, right? Similar to a pool type reactor, this just sits in the tank, and it doesn't have to have any energy input into having that cooling system function as it should, okay? There were three main design objectives in order to ensure that this reactor was safe for education and research and training uses, okay? First was to make the reactor as safe and foolproof as possible. Even if you guys do a bad job as trainee operators and push the wrong things, it will be very, very difficult for you to harm the reactor or cause an accident. It's designed to be able to absorb your inexperience and your training status without causing a major problem, right? And so the engineers who put this together had to really work to make things very simple so that your input does not have a dramatic effect on the reactor. Another objective was to use a minimum critical mass. The AGN reactor has approximately 665 grams of uranium-235 dispersed in plastic discs. We talked about it being low temperature. We're still low temperature. We don't melt our plastic fuel, right? What's the normal material we use for fuel in reactors?
The or the what?
Those pellets. Where are those pellets made out of? Connor?
What was the question?
You know? What material do we normally make our fuel out of in commercial reactors?
The fuel itself?
Yeah.
Uranium-235 is the I can't remember what it's called, but it's like uranium-238 is the blanket.
So we've got our uranium-235, that's what we use here. But normally, our fuel is uranium dioxide. It's a ceramic, meant to withstand extremely high temperatures without cracking or melting, right? So just giving a scale of how baby this reactor is, we have plastic fuel in an environment where normally you have to have special ceramics, right? There also had an objective to provide a high analytical sensitivity. So for this reactor to be useful for research, there are a number of parameters that have to be very well known and understood so that we know that they're not variables when we go to take measurements or do experiments, right? And so not only do we want to make it an education reactor, but there was a research purpose, okay? So the safety of the AGN design lies in three main areas, okay? First of all, it's designed with a negative temperature coefficient. This is a standard design choice in basically every US reactor. It was not the choice in the Russian RBMK, which led to Chernobyl. So when we had an accident, the main difference between Chernobyl, which was a huge release of radioactivity and many deaths, and 3 Mile Island, which was a problem and a bad accident, but was something that could eventually be contained, was essentially this. There were other factors too. I don't want to oversimplify it, but this was huge. So essentially, what negative temperature coefficient means is that if we have our fuel, okay, this is our little, not going to use that marker. Okay, so we've got our fuel here, right? And we've got our atoms arranged in it, right, in some way. That's our U-235. And we have a neutron that comes in and it interacts. And this is what causes fission, right? As the temperature of our fuel goes up, right? So now we have that same fuel, but at a higher temperature. It's going to undergo something called Doppler broadening, where essentially the way that this looks to the neutron now, it appears like there's way less U-235 available for interaction. And so when that neutron tries to hit the fuel, it does not actually find a uranium-235 atom in order to create fission. So as your fuel gets hotter, it actually shuts down the fission reaction. So you have a temperature limit, and as the fuel gets above that, because your power is increasing too much, or you don't have the coolant that you need, or some other accident scenario, the reactor actually self-limits its reaction, and it stops fissioning. This is cyclical, right? So it's not as good as having a scram that worked. And we'll talk to this thermal safety fuse in just a minute. But as it gets too warm, it's literally going to stop reacting, right? It'll go from here to here. Then as it cools, it'll come back. And so you're kind of like stuck in this area, but it prevents us from having a runaway fission, because if we're not able to cool the reactor, we're going to stop having fission. We never get very close to this at the AGN. But one of the interesting things that happens with the AGN reactor is if it is a hot summer day and the water in our tank is already warm, we will not be able to run as long as on a cold winter day, because we will start getting warm enough that we see a little bit of this effect. So you can actually observe negative temperature coefficient in the AGN reactor based on a hot or cold day, which is really kind of fascinating, because we talk about this in nuclear engineering and we talk about this at larger power plants, but we don't ever get to this point until we're at extremely high temperatures, because we have ceramic fuel that doesn't get affected by heat until it's very, very high, right? Our plastic fuel can experience this at much lower temperatures, and so we can kind of see an effect from it. And I just think it's absolutely fascinating to watch that piece of theory actually come alive. Okay? So, the thermal safety fuse. The AGN reactor is essentially a little coffee can sized reactor. Okay? And it has plates of fuel stacked on top of each other. And then it has a little plate of metal, okay? That holds the top half of the core up. Then there's some more plates of fuel that are held up by this safety feature called the thermal fuse. And it's essentially a little plastic cup on a rod that is made of a plastic that melts at a lower temperature than our fuel plastic. So if the temperature starts to rise, which that temperature rise is our #1 indication of more fissions happening, which can be an indication of one of our control systems not working or an accident occurring. The biggest is going to be this sudden reactivity insertion. This is our major accident. If that temperature goes up because of that, this will melt. It will soften, essentially. And the bottom half of the core will fall down because it's no longer supported into the bottom of the reactor tank. Now, the top half of the fuel is so far away from the bottom half of the fuel, you can't have a critical reaction. We now have 2 subcritical halves. If you remember, we talked about one of the design objectives was to use a minimum critical mass. This is barely enough fuel to make fission happen in the AGN reactor. It is just enough. So as soon as any of it's gone, let alone half of it, you're not going to have a critical reactor. You're going to be very, very subcritical. So if you mess up and instead of slowly manipulating control rods, and you just add a whole bunch of reactivity all of a sudden as an operator, you're still not going to have a significant power rise. You're not going to have a significant creation of neutrons because you're going to attenuate that by the negative temperature coefficient and the melting of our safety fuse. So this is what they're talking about when they talk about this very safe design. You really can't cause a core meltdown at the AGN because it's either going to stop itself or it's going to stop itself. Now, we definitely don't want to get into these conditions where we're relying on these because I honestly don't know if ISU will purchase another safety fuse and put the reactor back together if we do this, right? I don't even know if they're still made because Aerojet doesn't exist as a company. So we'd have to find another reactor somewhere and scavenge it or get something specially made with uranium in it. And I honestly just don't know. The reactor at Oregon State University was removed because it broke a piece and they didn't want to repair it. So that does happen. So we definitely still want to follow our procedures and be good operators, but you're operating something incredibly safe and incredibly difficult to mess up. Yeah.
So has it not ever had the thermal safety fuse ripped?
No, nope, it's never been actuated. Okay. Core tank has been designed to contain any radiolytic or fission product gases that might diffuse out of the fuel tank. So our core tank is our fission gas barrier, right? It's going to hold those in. 65 mil commercial 6061 T6 aluminum is used throughout the core as a structural material. Does anyone know? We haven't gotten this in our materials class, but maybe Sue, you know, why do we use aluminum as a structural material? Not as strong as steel. Why is it better than steel for us to use?
Reflection.
Sorry, just a little louder. Okay, temperature. What'd you say, Connor?
Reflection.
Yeah, it doesn't break apart. It doesn't get brittle because it doesn't rust. Right? And Connor said reflection, which isn't quite right, but it doesn't absorb neutrons. Steel has some materials in it that will absorb neutrons, and you can activate the steel, it becomes radioactive. But that means it parasitically absorbs your neutrons, right? You're going to take them, and they're not going to be available for fission. The aluminum, they just pass right through. And we're in water at somewhat elevated temperatures, not very much for our reactor. Steel would rust. And you will notice when you guys get to open the tank and look inside that there are little rusticles hanging from it. A lot of that is because of how hard our water is that we filled the tank with. Okay. The reflector consists of 20 centimeter thick, high density. You don't have to memorize this, but you do need to know that it's a high density reflector. Graphite on all sides of the core. High density graphite is the standard reflector used in the nuclear industry. This ensures that any neutrons that do make it outside of our water and outside of our aluminum tank get shot right back in. Okay? There are holes for 4 safety control rods, 4 access points, and the glory hole, which we're going to call the central radiation facility because we're going to be modern professionals. We're not going to use glory hole. Okay? This central radiation facility is also the point where you're going to put in your startup sources. The control rods come in and out the bottom of the reactor, and the 4 access ports are perpendicular to the central radiation facility, the CIF, so that you can put different materials in the reactor to do different activation experiments or research. Okay? There's a plug in the graphite and a cover on the core tank that lets you actually open it and access the inside of it. The graphite reflector that's inside the reactor weighs about 700 pounds because we're using high density graphite. Very heavy, the heaviest component. Okay? 10 centimeters of lead completely surround the core and the reflector. Okay? So we've got a reactor, it's inside an aluminum tank. Okay? Then around that, you're actually going to have your water that's inside our reactor tank. And inside of that, there's going to be lead and reflector. Okay? The lead, second most, the lead is 7,500 pounds. Right? So even though this is huge, it's bigger. So let's look at a picture. Here's our 4 access points, right? Our control rods come up from the bottom, and this is the central irradiation facility. So it runs this way while these run that way. There's a man port here, this opens, and then there's graphite in there, this plug that can be taken out. So, schematic. We've got our core tank right here, this aluminum, okay? Right outside the aluminum, you have this 20 centimeter thick graphite reflector, okay? Then we have our 10 centimeter thick lead shield, okay? All of this sits in another little tank made of aluminum, okay? This is our access port. Up here we have a thermal column. This is another experimental facility, okay? It has some unique properties in how it interacts with neutrons coming off the core. So you can do some interesting experiments there. Then you have this large outer core tank, which is filled with water. Sorry, water tank, right? So core tank, reactor tank, water tank. But a lot of times when you're standing outside looking at this, people might say core tank. This is the reactor tank. It holds the whole thing. The core tank, per what the SAR says, is this aluminum that's right around the actual fuel. Okay? Our control rods are fuel, and they come from the bottom. When they're out of the core, they have removed fuel, and because we have barely enough uranium to get critical, we now no longer have a reacting reactor, right? So they're gravity fed. When we scram them, essentially pieces of fuel just fall out of the reactor. Very simple. We have an access port and support pedestal. Down in here is where our seismic gram is located. Our central irradiation facility and our access ports for our experimental facilities run perpendicular to each other. Okay? So here and here. Look at a couple pictures of this. What do you think you're looking at? Does anyone know?
Top.
It is the top. So what part would be right under the reactor tank? Okay. So our thermal column is a little bit of a trick question. It's actually made of graphite. These are graphite blocks. And this is exactly what the reflector looks like as well. Okay. So the bricks that we saw that kind of make our structure and shielding, right? Those stacked around the reactor. This is the reactor tank. This is one of our detector systems that goes into the water. We took off our porthole and we saw the thermal column. Underneath that would be the lead. Okay. There are 3 independent detectors that monitor neutron flux. The neutron flux is a piece of information that gives us our ability to infer what's happening in the core. We need to know that information to understand neutron population, criticality, power levels, basically everything but temperature we're going to get through our neutron measurement, okay? There are 2 ionization chambers and a proportional counter. I'm not sure which is the one that's broken. Ionization chambers have gas inside of them. And when your neutron passes through and interacts, you get a signal. And the proportional counter works slightly differently. I have some detector materials and books that you guys can look at to get a little bit better grasp on these. I think it'll be easier for you to see them and have Ted and Jonathan kind of explain the difference because they're so similar. Seeing them and knowing is going to be the better way to learn these. But you do need to know you have 2 ionization chambers and a proportional counter. I guarantee that's going to be a question on the exam.
Do we know why the detector broke?
It's old.
Okay.
So is the ionization chamber more like a cloud chamber than the other?
No, because the cloud chamber, like you're getting to see the reaction, but we're not producing a signal. There's certain types of gas ions put in and they separate, and that difference based on how they interact with the neutron creates voltage that creates a signal. So it's slightly different. It's actually in one of the first year books that you've seen. There's a great description of how these work. So I'll make that available to you guys. But Ted and Jonathan will be, I think, better able to cover it in person, where you can actually see where these are. And where they are is inside the water, right here. Okay? There's our 3 detectors. So again, this is those access points. The kind of experimental facility that they're called is Beansport, right? And then here's your central radiation facility right through here. So this kind of just is showing if you're on top of the reactor looking down what you're going to see. Okay. So I mentioned this. Lower section of the core tank holds approximately 1/2 of the core material, as well as part of the graphite reflector. And they're both supported by an aluminum rod that projects downward from this thermal safety fuse. I call it a link because it being solid is what holds that rod up, and as it softens, that link that keeps that connection is going to fall out. That helps me think of it that way, okay? There is ample space at the bottom of the cylinder, that is our core tank, to ensure free fall of the bottom half of the core plus this bottom half of the graphite reflector in the event that the fuse link melts from an accidental nuclear excursion. So going back just a few photos, all of this space, right? We've got our graphite, we've got more than enough space for that to fall enough to separate so that we don't have a critical core. Okay? So when you look at the tank, it's not falling all the way down here into our control rod drive, but it is falling here inside our core tank. Yeah. This is the fuel right here. Right? And so there's a little support plate right here that holds the top up. And this hole right here is our thermal fuse that holds the bottom up. And so when it melts, essentially what happens is the connection that's holding these allows these all to slide down. Yes. So here and here are graphite, and then this is more graphite, but it's outside the core tank, so it won't move when the core separates. Okay, so we're gonna look at this a little closer. This is the cover to our core tank, right? And this is the boundary of it. This is a drawing from the reactor SAR, so it says glory hole. I didn't get to redraw it. I redrew and renamed this on every single one I used in my thesis. It comes right through the middle, okay? Our thermal fuse comes right up here, and essentially what it does is just below our central radiation facility, we've got that plate, all right? And all this bottom fuel's here. So when this fuse melts, essentially, this now slides down with all of this. So the thermal fuse essentially presses up against this and holds everything up. And then when it melts, it all falls down the rod, okay? The thermal fuse is connected to this core support assembly, right? Because it is what holds it up in normal conditions. It's just designed to be able to fail. This drawing is to scale. I have a little bit, I think, more detailed drawing from my thesis, where you can see, even though there's only 3 fuel plates here, the fuel in the bottom half of the reactor is thicker plates. These are thinner plates. So there's about the same amount of uranium-235 in the bottom and the top. Okay? We have a fine control rod and 3 coarse control rods. This one is much skinnier and holds no fuel. Okay? The thermal fuse is less than a centimeter thick, 0.95 centimeters thick, 2.2 centimeter diameter. So it's a tiny little disc, right? And it being small is part of what allows it to melt sooner, okay? .6 by 24.7, right? So just one of those big coffee cans. That's our reactor. Does that make sense? Everyone see what there is on this drawing? Getting a good idea of what our reactor looks like?
So it would only slide down to like under that 2.3 or that,
Right
so
here,
it would go all the way that far down.
5 centimeters. Nope, nope. So this graphite
Would only fall
is
where like
all
your middle
supported,
finger,
right?
right?
Yep. So it's going to drop 5 centimeters. So this is going to be essentially about right here, the top of it.
So the bottom one would be like where that little lip is.
Yeah. Because this is the amount that it's all held up floating in the air, right? That's the space that allows for free fall. It's only about 5 centimeters that it drops. But because one of our design goals was that we have minimal critical mass, we have just barely exactly the right amount of fuel to go critical. So as soon as you remove any, you're not going to go critical, let alone move half of it 5 centimeters away. That's forever for a neutron to travel, right? Okay. So, like we said, the cores are the discs are different thicknesses. Okay, thickest ones are 4 centimeters, smallest ones are 1 centimeter. And another unique property is if you see these control rods go through these first 4, right? So our fuel that's coming from the control rods has to insert into these first 4 control rods. So the fuel actually looks like this, where it has room for our 3 coarse control rods and our 1 skinny fine control rod to insert. This is the bottom half of the central radiation facility, right? So you can stick something through that experiment port. There's a piece of aluminum pipe that runs through here, and we can put stuff right through the middle of the core. Okay? So this uranium plastic is machined to allow all of these pieces to fit together. And this is one of our thicker 4-centimeter thick discs. Now, this very top disc is called the reactivity adding disc. It is one of the smaller discs. And what happened is, after they moved the reactor from the physics building into the brand new Lilly Bridge engineering building and into its own reactor lab, when they took it apart and had everything open, they realized that it was not really staying critical long enough for any real operations. It would get warm enough to start shutting itself down because of its negative temperature coefficient after just like an hour of operation. So they decided to take this fuel disc and cut it to add a little bit more fuel. So the plastic that our fuel is in is polyethylene, okay? The top few plates are pure polyethylene, which thermalizes our neutrons. So the uranium is dispersed in this material that helps create better conditions for fission. And they just took a chunk of an extra fuel plate from somewhere, cut it in quarters, cut the polyethylene, and stuck this thing in there so they could get a little bit more reactivity. Okay? Then, sometime later, they said, oh, hey, it's still not reacting enough. So they took some pieces from a broken control rod and further stuck those in. And they did this several years apart and didn't keep great records. But this is what it looks like now. Yeah.
Does that have to get approved through?
At the time that they did this, they were still within their license. Today, I can't imagine doing this without a significant amount of approval. Okay? Sometime before 1978, because there's pictures when they opened the core up in 1978 where this existed, but this is originally what that top disc looked like, right? So this is how it came from Aerojet General Nucleonics. This is what a picture in 1978 looks like. So sometime between there, they said, hey, we need more reactivity. Now, they were still under their licensed amount of reactivity, under their licensed amount of power. So they're fine. We didn't violate anything. I just don't think that this would be tolerated now in our current environment. Okay. We're going to look in detail at the thermal fuse, and then we're going to knock it off for today. There's a few slides left on this, but you guys should be reading the SAR. You can review these, and if you have questions, come and ask me. So on this side, this is normal. The thermal fuse is solid, small little disc that's inside this core support assembly. It has a little holder, and then this tube fits over this rod, okay? When it softens, essentially, this punches through, and everything that's attached to this is no longer supported, and it falls 5 centimeters into the bottom. So the core fuel is polyethylene, right? This is polystyrene. And its melting temperature is about 100 degrees Celsius. So basically water. So it's going to melt very low, right? This is made of aluminum, right? So is this, like most of our core supports. Review on your own, just this description of the fueled safety rods. They've got some pictures that kind of just tell you what the components are. This is an actual pellet from the fine control rod. And then we will talk next week about instrumentation and SAR Chapter 5. So we'll start here on this slide 22 and talk about the recorders and the detectors. So you guys read about the control rods on your own. Any questions? Yeah. We do have a textbook. It's this one. And it should be at the bookstore. It's like $20.
Amazon has it too, because,
Amazon does.
yeah, just on a little Kindle reader.
We'll be talking about that one as we go. We're going to cover the reactor SAR first, but it's a great book. It's written by an operator, and so it really gives you some good perspectives. Even though he's talking about facilities larger than the AGN, it's a good textbook. So, any other questions? No? Okay. Have a great week, guys.